Okay, this is big and it's complicated, and thank goodness we have some experts with us. Emily Eaton teaches geography and environmental studies at the University of Regina. She researches the influence of the fossil fuel industry. And if you don't know what climate delayism is, we have Sonia Solomon here to sort that out for us. She's a deputy director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy at McGill. Also with us, Imran Ahmed, the CEO of the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which has done extensive research on online climate denial. Great to have you all with us.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
Let's start with you, Imran. Your organization looked at thousands of videos. I understand 96 different YouTube channels to learn about this new denial. Tell us the underlying goal of all of this.
Well, our researchers looked at 4,500 hours of videos by those 96 channels, 12,000 videos in total. And what we were looking for was, how have the claims changed over the past 5 years? What we found was a massive increase in what we call the new denial. So undermining faith in climate solutions and attacking climate scientists. And bizarrely saying that climate change is good for the planet. But also because cynics like the people, climate deniers, now they used to claim they cared about the science. They said we're having a scientific debate.
Right.
But the fact that they've moved from saying climate change isn't happening to climate change is happening, but the solutions don't work, shows that they only have one goal: to stop action on climate change. It was never a good faith debate. It was always about protecting the profits of the oil and gas lobby.
Okay, we'll get into that. And Emily, I want to ask, in your research, did you see exactly when that changed from denial to let's delay this action, like Imran just talked about?
Really, what I've noticed and others have noticed in this field is since the Paris Agreement, which really cast uncertainty about the future of fossil fuels, because we know that more than 80% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide come from one industry, the fossil fuel industry. And so if we're going to have a hope of keeping climate change to a habitable level for the world, around 2 degrees Celsius, then what we need to do is phase out fossil fuels. And so therefore, companies around this time sort of shifted towards pledging these commitments to a net zero future, because they understood, I think, that the very future of their industries were at stake. And so what they were trying to do was to carve out a space for themselves in this future through all sorts of mis and disinformation.
And Sonia, you looked at some of that climate disinfo, and you found 5 key narratives that really emerged in Canada. Walk me through a few of them briefly.
Sure. So our research at McGill found what we are calling an impact gap. So while around 74% of the Canadians that we surveyed agree that climate change is real, less than half believe it directly affects them, which is kind of a strange way to conceptualize it, right? Believing in climate change is real, but thinking it won't affect you is like smelling smoke in your house, but not checking for fire. So we wanted to test the particular narratives that really resonate with Canadians, because they often tie into longstanding beliefs that we have about our national identity and about our economy. So, for example, one really prominent narrative is this idea of ethical oil, which is kind of a delay message that argues that we can continue to extract fossil fuels because Canadian oil is somehow more ethical than other countries, let's say Saudi Arabia or Russia, who have a much more poor human rights footprint.
I've heard that a lot. That is not true?
Yeah. No, so that's a prominent narrative that circulates online. And what makes disinformation so particularly challenging is because it does attach itself to kind of kernels of truth or ideas that sound really sensible. So another prominent one we found in Canada that really resonated with public opinion is climate action is kind of pushed by these hypocritical elites. And so therefore their recommendations should be discredited. You might have seen this crop up during, this was super popular during the annual COP meetings. Look at all these world leaders wanting to address the climate crisis, but they're, on the other hand, taking private jets to travel. So a lot of these narratives they are much more nuanced, but the goal remains the same,
Right.
which is to delay any policy or any action to mitigate the climate crisis.
I just want to pick up on the elites that are traveling to these climate conferences. I mean, there is some truth to that, Sonia, right? Like getting on planes, but you're saying that's not the whole picture.
Certainly. So what that does is it puts the focus on kind of individual consumption habits. It individualizes the problem instead of taking the focus away from these really structural, systemic policy and regulatory changes that we need, and not just in Canada, but beyond.
Imran, yeah, it's a very good point. Imran, I know your research is more global when you're looking at the YouTube videos, and I'm very curious, do we know who's behind some of these most successful campaigns pushing these narratives of that climate denial?
Well, we can certainly tell you who the main pushers of these narratives are, and that's the 96 channels that we looked at that were some of the most prominent climate deniers around. But here's the rub. They're making a lot of bank out of these videos. Truth is that climate denial is a big business. It's not only funded by the oil and gas lobby and their various their AstroTurf groups, but it's also increasingly funded by social media platforms which pay these people to produce content, pay them per view. So one of the biggest monetizers, one of the biggest funders of climate denial on the planet now is actually Google. That nice search engine company that says they do no evil. They own YouTube, and they're sharing 55-45, the advertising revenue on these videos, these cynical videos produced by people who want to delay climate action by lying. And yes, there are occasionally kernels of truth studded around here and there, but at the heart is a lie, which is that the climate isn't changing and that there's nothing that we can do to fix the problem that we have right now.
I want to talk about who this impacts. Imran, who is watching these climate denial videos and who's being swayed into thinking it's not a big deal?
I mean, look, YouTube is one of the biggest platforms on the planet, if not the single biggest media platform consumed by billions of people around the world, and by the vast majority, I mean, we're talking 90+% of young people. So who is being infected with these lies? It is almost everyone. But who's particularly vulnerable? People with a low level of information, and that particularly impacts young people. And, superficially, these claims are, when asserted with enough confidence, a lie can seem like the truth. For example, if someone said to you very assertively, very confidently, and you didn't know better, that the environment, that concerning electric vehicles, they end up producing 3 times as much toxic pollution in their supply chain and in the production as conventional gas vehicles. Well, that's just fundamentally untrue, but that's the kind of claim that we were looking at. Or the president of Heartland Institute, which is a really big climate denying organization in the United States, which says that wind power would require leveling half of our forests, half of our wildlife habitat, half of our open plains. Now that is fundamentally untrue. The footprint of renewables is about the same as the current oil and gas industry, so no real change. But these lies told confidently enough and on platforms that people think they can trust.
Right. That's where we all get messed up. Emily, just quickly to you, we've heard a little bit about oil and gas in this conversation, but your research looks at the fossil fuel industry and how they're influencing, and I was really interested in how it looks at kids being a part of this conversation. So tell me about what you're most worried about in that regard.
Yeah, well, we've done some studies about how the fossil fuel industry has created a set of curriculum resources and inserted itself into classrooms in Canada. And certainly they're doing that through the sort of new climate delay, which is really about suggesting that, we've heard this already, that the solutions to climate change are about individual action. So go home and turn off your lights and have a shorter shower. We've also heard in those curriculum resources is basically just an insertion of themselves and their perspectives into the debate. So the idea is that, we can't talk about renewable energy if we don't also talk about fossil fuels.
Mm.
Every type of energy production has environmental impacts, therefore we should do nothing. So a lot of these messages are really in these curriculum resources, and as teachers have less time and less prep time, and these resources are available freely on the internet in packaged ways that are appealing to students, we're finding that teachers are going to those resources more, and that really structures what's happening in the classroom and how students are sort of developing their minds and their ideas about climate change for the future.
Very interesting. Sonia, I want to come to you. I imagine that there's some apathy out there around, doomerism, this feeling like climate change is inevitable, so I can't do anything about it. How has the new denial really played into public opinion on just how we face this crisis?
Yeah, so we've seen that Canadians still care about the climate. I don't think it's a question of has the public stopped caring? It's really have politicians stopped listening. Social media platforms like Meta and X are aware that climate disinformation is rising online, but are not doing anything about it. So they play a really outsized role in this because their systems are designed to spread this kind of attention-grabbing content, whether it's true or not, or whether it's harmful or not. So disinformation is not really like an error. It's kind of the goal of these systems that maximize this kind of inflammatory content. And we're in a really particular situation now because these platforms have sort of explicitly refused to deal with these issues. Before, they would sort of promise to fix the problem at least, sort of rarely do enough to enforce their own rules. But we're in a situation where Meta has ended its fact-checking program. X has fired the teams that would, typically check this kind of content. Just on X alone, climate misinformation rose by kind of an astonishing 300% in the first year that Elon Musk took over. So we really need to get at the systemic problems. 300%.
That's
in just
wild.
that 1 year. Yes. Yeah.
It's important to look at those stats because it gives you a sense of even where we came from.
Absolutely. And it gives you that power imbalance, right? Platforms are allowed to not only amplify and grow from these narratives, but directly profit from them.
Okay, so Emily, let me come to you. What needs to be done now that we're facing this new approach?
Wow, yeah, well, those are a really good questions. So we do know that if we want a habitable planet in the future, we need to phase out fossil fuels. Those industries need to lose their power over our social institutions, over our political process, where they're doing a lot of lobbying. I live in Western Canada where, partly because of the voices out here, Carney's the first thing he did when he became prime minister was to repeal the carbon tax. There's a lot of talk of Western separation. So I think it's really time to put some checks and balances in place, to not provide more power to this industry that already has this outsized influence.
And yet we have the prime minister saying we're going to be an energy superpower with everything that's happening down south and our economy at risk. This is the challenging time that we're in. Sonia, I want to ask, are regulatory changes the only answer here when it comes to controlling some of even the tech that you're talking about?
I think there are very key and crucial answers. So to address the climate crisis, we really have to address our information ecosystem, because it's that ecosystem that shapes public understanding and political will. So I think in Canada, that starts with, digital governance legislation that treats climate disinformation as a real and measurable threat, much like other forms of harmful content. So we need more transparency from platforms to see how these climate narratives are being amplified or distorted. We need access to that data for researchers or journalists looking to study this problem. And we really need accountability for mechanisms that platforms kind of repeatedly fail to address these really systemic harms. I don't think you can build good climate policy on a foundation of bad tech policy.
Mm-hmm. Imran, last question to you, and I got 30 seconds. I'm just curious, how much do these platforms make when they're pushing these false narratives?
I mean, we calculated that the videos that we looked at across those 36 channels were worth about 15 million US dollars per annum, just under. So, I mean, it's relatively small amounts of money for the social media companies. It's big money for the people producing who get a significant chunk of that cash.
Great to have you all on. I could talk to you all day. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.